Our next speaker, James Sherr, is an associate fellow and former head of Russia and Eurasia program at the well-renowned Chatham House in the United Kingdom. He has published extensively on Soviet and Russian military, security, and foreign policy, as well as energy security, the Black Sea region, and Ukraine's efforts to deal with Russia, the West, and its own domestic problems. Please welcome Mr. James Sherr.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, may I begin by expressing not only my thanks to the Norwegian-Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, but my congratulations. I find it astonishing, not just impressive, that your organization has been able to stimulate so much interest in Norway about Ukraine and attract participants here of this range and scale. So I'm very impressed indeed. Let me, if I may, try to construct a bridge between some of the issues that have just been discussed and many of the more practical issues on your mind as investors, which will be discussed in greater detail this afternoon. And let me do this in my customary spirit, which is one of sometimes bleak realism. I am one of those people who is paid, when he is paid, to say things to people that they need to hear but don't want to. And my own expectation, my own challenge today is to say certain things to you that I hope you will appreciate later, even if you don't appreciate hearing all of them today. There's an old expression about Russia, that Russia is never as strong nor as weak as it seems. Well, I have coined an expression about Ukraine, which has served me very well over the past 25 years. In Ukraine, things are never as good or as bad as they seem. When a former British Prime Minister, John Major, in 1992 described Ukraine as the pivot of the future architecture of Europe, he was not describing something good or bad. What he was saying was, what happens in Ukraine will be of fundamental importance to others. And we can certainly see that now. And that will continue to be the case, whatever looks like the ultimate outcome of the current conflict with Russia and events in Donbass and events internally. Those over this 25-year period of Ukraine's independence who have wagered too much on Ukraine's success have been disappointed. But those who have wagered on its failure have themselves failed. And they have been deeply surprised. Now, Ukraine's failure is something which is built into the Russian metabolism. There is an old Russian expression, «Самостоятельной Украине никогда не будет», which means Ukraine will never be able to stand on its own. It will never be able to rely on itself. And for 25 years, not just under Vladimir Putin, Russian policy has been predicated on the assumption that Ukraine cannot succeed and also must not be allowed to. Ukraine should be independent, but what its independence means should be decided in Moscow and not in Kiev. That Ukraine must naturally converge with Russia and develop in the same way. And all means of the state within the bounds of safety were always used to this end. And suddenly, as we saw in 2014, not unexpectedly, the means shifted from what I've called soft coercion into hard power. And that calculation has been Russia's greatest strategic miscalculation of the post-Soviet period. But the first practical point I must make for you as investors is that although Russia has failed, it has not yet been defeated. It has not been defeated either in the Donbass, nor, more importantly, has it been defeated with respect to its wider objectives for Ukraine as a whole. Donbass does not matter to Russia. Crimea does not matter to Russia. What matters to Russia is having a wedge, a lever, that will enable it to dictate the future course of Ukraine as a whole. And Russia will not surrender the eastern border of Ukraine until it establishes, with Western acquiescence, a right to control the western border of Ukraine politically and block its path to the west. And this is still an issue which is open. So it is a first factor of uncertainty which you as investors must consider. And Monsieur Bernard-Henri Lévy was absolutely right that here the critical variable is how strong Europe will be, because we know that Ukraine is strong. Second issue I would like to address, it's a contextual issue. What is remarkable sitting in Britain and being often in other countries in Europe is the number of people one finds who flatly and rightly condemn Russia's actions, but continue to think of Ukraine in the way Russians portray it, as a failed state. For 25 years I have heard people, influential, articulate, educated people in my country and elsewhere refer to Ukraine as a failed state, and one hears it now. So let me very clearly outline the four respects in which this country is anything but a failed state. First, throughout all of this time, its own Ukrainians have been able to take for granted not only free and relatively proper elections, but fundamental democratic freedoms like speech and association, religion, ethnicity, ethnic tolerance, contrary to what Russia says, linguistic tolerance. Ukraine has consistently received plaudits from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the UN, the OSCE, in all these respects. Secondly, even after revolutionary events, two Maidans, for both good and ill, the outcome was never revolutionary. The outcome was always evolutionary, because there is inside Ukraine a deep inhibition, apprehension about instability and violence. Thirdly, a great spirit of self-reliance and civic-mindedness on the part of the most ordinary people. In winter 2013, there was a blizzard in Kiev. Yanukovych was in power. His satrap was mayor in Kiev. There are huge budgets in Kiev. Nothing was done. I was there. The whole city just spontaneously organized itself, cleaned up the snow, brought tea and food to little old ladies, and so on and so forth. This is Ukrainian civic reliance. It's that civic reliance that we see in eastern Ukraine. Where has Ukrainian national sentiment and resistance been tougher? It's been in all these parts of eastern Ukraine that the Russians consider nashi, theirs. And the last point, of course, is that now, almost 2 years after this insurgency has started, after this very nasty insurgency backed by economic warfare, and 2 massive military offensives with general-purpose Russian forces, what do Russia and its proxies control in Ukraine? 5% of its territory, and no more. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a description of a failed state. The problem, though, is a different one, and it's a big one. The problem is that the state has consistently lagged behind the country in its strengths and in its qualities. The Ukrainian state today, its state structures, are the biggest obstacle that President Poroshenko faces to achieving the objectives that he and the people who elected him have for Ukraine and its future. The culture of power of Ukraine, this is known to any taxi driver, is the biggest weight and burden and drain on the country's progress. This culture of power is entrenched. It has demonstrated infinite capacity for renewal and revival and for doing damage. And it reflects a combination of two things. First, it is at one level a continuation of Soviet administrative culture, a culture which penalizes initiative and which is anti-democratic in its very essence. And I hear this on a day-to-day basis from all of my most talented friends inside different parts of Ukrainian administration. It's understood in this type of culture. The person who calls attention to a problem is the person who gets blamed for it. The worst thing a presidential advisor can do is give advice, likely to be dismissed. This is something Ukraine has inherited. Unless it's understood as a profound defect, it is not going to change. And the second aspect of this culture, which is fused with it, is a characteristic post-Soviet merger of money and power. What the West calls corruption, in practice, means something much more concrete in practice. First, it means in all spheres, and I'm not simply talking here about central government. I'm talking about any echelon of power. The use of public position for private gain. Much as two Maidans were about Europe joining Europe, they were about European values, but underneath this was about a conviction of society that at last we must have people that govern the country in the interests of the country and not in the interests of themselves. This is the fundamental demand. The second thing that we mean by corruption is the capture of state and public institutions by corporate and clan interests and alliances between political and corporate clans. So that those institutions you look upon, the citizen looks upon, as a guarantor of his rights and protection in fact becomes the greatest source of uncertainty and instability in their lives. And the third thing we mean by it is a subordination of law and the judicial bodies to money and power. They are basically bespoke, negotiable jurisprudence, rather than jurisprudence operating in accordance with law. And finally, in all spheres, the preeminence of shadow, hidden structures of power over the formal, official, visible, and public ones. Until these issues are addressed in a sustained and systematic way, we will not be able to say with confidence that Ukraine is definitely on track to become the kind of country Ukrainians want to become. Which is one that is converging with the European model and is the journey that Poland and Estonia and a number of other countries have taken. Today, the picture is very mixed. Those who speak about bold and courageous and well-planned reform are not lying. But it is part of the story because although that is taking place, there are other areas where regression is taking place, and there is just a large unmapped area where it's very difficult to know what is taking place. The most optimistic but seasoned practical Ukrainians I know will all say the same thing. This is the most reformist government in Ukraine's history. But this is a double-edged compliment, and there needs to be a baseline of realism. You will also be told something else. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, President Poroshenko are transitional figures of necessity. They embody all the contradictions of people who come from this culture of power who at the same time want to change it. And there are limitations on this. So this is a second factor of uncertainty that has to be understood and respected. The underlying factor of confidence, though, is the country itself, the country which is setting the agenda and setting the pace, the country which has stood up to a nuclear power. And it is that and the presence of so many talented people now, more than ever before, in official structures that must, I think, for a far-sighted investor, make Ukraine intrinsically interesting. But bear in mind the obvious if you're thinking of investing there. There is still a war. There is also an economic war. You cannot expect today, in these conditions, to find a stable regulatory environment. You cannot expect to find Ukrainians do not believe they operate in an environment of security. You can't expect it. The impressive thing, though, is that even in these conditions which I have described, Ukraine is definitely moving forward, not backwards. My final set of points. Let me, if I may, distill and present to you the lessons I think experienced Ukrainians have understood as guides to doing good business in Ukraine. I'm not talking about bad business, but good business. And there are Ukrainians and Ukrainian entities who struggle and even succeed in these conditions in doing good and real business. And I think these guidelines must also be a baseline for anyone here who is interested in investing there. Number one, the first essential is to have knowledge of the informal rules and of the relevant players in the sector you are planning to invest in, and the region and the locality. You must invest the time, you must do the research to know how things really work, who you need to talk to. Secondly, you must invest. You need connections and alliances if you are to do business successfully. The most important words, the prerequisites of business activity in Ukraine and many other countries of that region are syazi, connections, and kryshi, roofs, shelters, protection. Third, you have to, even when things are up and running and starting to go well, by comparison to doing business in Poland, and certainly by comparison to doing business in Norway, you must be prepared to spend a lot of your time in non-business activity. Relationships, constant diligence, constantly dealing with friends, potential rivals, potential enemies. Fourth, patience. And fifth, you always need to have a plan B. If you do all the other things I mentioned, you will basically develop and you will have available a set of membranes that will be able to sense when conditions might be changing, when the current set of informal rules could be changing to your disadvantage, and you will have warning and you will be able to adapt. Now, if you're willing to invest in these things, if this becomes part of what you mean by investment, rather than just taking money out of your pocket and putting it somewhere, then this is a country that you will find very rewarding for you. It will demand all of your efforts, but as Ukraine succeeds, so will you. Because I think I am right to be a long-term optimist about Ukraine, and I believe Ukraine will succeed. The time to begin this process, this is a time to begin this process, to establish yourselves, so that in the end, when the country does well, so will you. So on that note, I think in good time, let me leave it there, and I look forward to discussion later on in the day. Thank you very much.